Welcome back to the Black Pill. Here's another misconception about psychology. Psychology is about Freudian analysis. Variously, Freud was a psychologist. Freud was a scientist. We owe everything to Freud. And the truth about this is we owe almost nothing to Freud. Freud didn't have really good ideas. Okay. The idea of talk therapy, that pretty much harkens back to Freud. The idea of a subconscious or unconscious mind, that was a good idea he had. Working with dreams in a very, very respectful way. If you read one book about dream analysis and interpretation, get Freud's on the interpretation of dreams. It's magnificent. But Freud was wrong about basically everything else. Freud was not a scientist. He couldn't have been a scientist because no one was really a scientist in the 1800s. We hadn't invented science the way that we think about it in modernity. We hadn't formalized the processes, and the philosophy of science was still in its infancy. Freud was a natural philosopher. And natural philosophy, it's sort of the precursor to science. It's the stuff that the ancient Greeks and Romans were doing. In natural philosophy, what you do is you wander through the world and you sort of trip over a phenomenon. And then just because you're an objective being in a universe, the phenomenon captures your attention. Then you investigate the phenomenon, you attempt to explain it, you create an explanatory framework for that phenomenon, and then you believe yourself. That's it. You write your theory, in the form of a song or an epic poem or an epigram or something, and you run it to the king or the emperor or whoever's around, and you proclaim it, and then you defend it. Anyone who challenges, you threaten to wrestle or fist fight or whatever, and defeat them with rhetoric, and you defend your idea, and your idea is true. That's not science. In science, we would wander through the universe and trip across a phenomenon, and it would capture our attention, and at least in modernity, we would have to wonder why. Why did that capture my attention at this moment? What is it about me that I'm interested in this thing, okay? In modern science, you're expected to sort of own up to your own biases and preconceptions and objectives. We are not objective beings. Objectivity is ultimately impossible. And then you would develop some explanatory framework. You can only call that explanatory framework a theory if it results in one or more falsifiable hypotheses. That is, your idea has to be, at least in principle, disprovable. There has to be some procedure I could do which would convince you that the thing you're proclaiming is not the truth. Then you attempt to falsify your own idea. You attempt that vigorously and perhaps multiple times, and you only proclaim that you've discovered something when your idea has withstood multiple attempts at falsification and has been replicated. That's science. Freud was not a scientist. He was a natural philosopher. And so he's sitting in his therapy room, talking to sexually repressed Viennese women in the 1800s. Very, very sexually repressive society, and that's why he found so much sexual repression. And he sort of generalizes the things he hears in those rooms to other people, and he uses Greek and Roman mythology, stuff like Electra, and to try and explain, to have a framework, a theoretical framework, to explain the things that he's seeing in these therapy sessions. He never attempts to falsify them. He's never concerned that they be falsifiable. Science hasn't gotten that far, and Freud hasn't gotten that far. The next point is Sigmund Freud was not a psychologist. He was a psychiatrist, and he didn't even want to be a psychiatrist. He wanted to be a neurologist. So he went through all the work to become a neurologist, but he was a Jewish man in one of the most racist places ever to exist on the face of the earth. And so when he was done with all of his education and training, they wouldn't let him through the hospital doors, let alone grant him admitting privileges, right? So his career in medicine he dreamed of was denied at the final hurdle. And that's why he had a private practice, and that's why he's doing talk therapy. He's not a psychologist at all. He's a frustrated MD with no opportunity to practice because of racism. And, you know, psychiatry is not psychology. Freud's really influential mostly in the negative. There are a few remaining, like, orthodox Freudians, but the rest of us kind of look at them somewhat askance. Because Freudian stuff is like, it's obvious nonsense, it's obvious castles built in the air on no particular foundation with no way to discredit or disprove the ideas. And his ideas are like, man, they're pretty sexist. You know what I mean? You take that stuff about sexual repression in 1800s Vienna and try to apply it to 21st century Americans. It's not a good fit. It's not very reasonable, and it's psychobabble. So, Freud's most influential ideas, the stuff that we still use. The unconscious mind, some people still use dream work, you know, do that carefully and respectfully. Latent homosexuality, that has a little bit of empirical support. We've talked about that before. The idea that homophobia is not fear of gay people, it's the fear of one's own gay tendencies in a homophobic society that creates reaction formation. So the person who thinks they're straight, the man who thinks he's very, very straight, sees gay people doing gay stuff and is afraid, is terrified at his core that he might be gay, and converts that fear into rage and hates the people he sees. It's an okay idea. It works. And then again, Freudianism is mostly still around in the negative. That is, behavioral psychology arises really in opposition to Freudian psychiatry. That's when the medical system has control of psychology as a practice. To be a psychologist, you have to license as a psychiatrist, which means you have to go to med school. But the stuff we're doing is explicitly non-medical. Like John B. Watson and all those old guys, they want to practice psychology like a chemist practices chemistry, right? Like Wilhelm Wundt is practicing psychology in Germany. And then humanism comes up as a reaction both to Freud and his weird sky castles built on no foundation, the medical control of the practice, and behaviorism, which goes a little far in the other direction. By only talking about what's observable and measurable, you leave out most of human experience, and so humanism arises in response to all of that. And so, do we owe very much in psychology to Freud? Well, his ideas are not fecund. They don't kind of reach out and touch us. There's very little in psychology that is based on what Freud had to say about his patients in 19th century Vienna. Very, very little. The idea of doing talking therapy, that's about the only thing that really sticks. So Freud, not central to the practice of psychology, not very influential.